Hello, everyone. It's Velma McCall at Ernst Strategy Group. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to moderate this second portion, Going Green, How Technology Can Improve Employee Health and Reduce Emissions. Like the last panel, which was great, and we're diving in today. We're diving into the details today because that's where we think we can find some good policy recommendations and policy solutions. So thanks for sticking with us while we talk about highly technical things like deep tech retrofits and shallow retrofits. And we're going to get into that a little bit more, but we hope that you understand that that's to start to move the policy conversation along. We have experts that combine an understanding of the technologies available, the state of the built environment, the requirements of the MUSH sector, which for those of you who don't know, we affectionately term municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. And I think we heard from Tony a little bit of the perspective from the school sector. And he touched a little bit on what it's like in the hospital sector, especially, and we're seeing it now here in the COVID pandemic, particularly around long-term care facilities, because there's the state of the buildings that have to be considered there as we move to the next phase. But there is tremendous potential, as you just heard, to unlock these environments with investments in more efficient leading edge technologies. And I was particularly interested to take note of the idea that we should be thinking of buildings as computers now, because a lot of what we're going to talk about today is about how we move buildings towards that so we get cleaner air and lower GHG emissions and better outcomes overall. The other thing we're going to talk about in this session is we're going to talk a little bit about government operations. So we have, after the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate a couple of years ago, we have governments at every level, provincial and federal, who are working to green their government operations because they believe that they have to put their money where their mouth is. And so at the federal level, that has resulted in a $2.1 billion investment to meet that goal. So you should know that national defense and public services and procurement account for 75% of all government greenhouse gas emissions. And so those two departments in particular are focusing on that. So as I turn to the panel, I think what we're trying to do is identify opportunities and hurdles in each of these areas and how we might more quickly reduce emissions and increase those health outcomes in our built environment. And I think we're going to have a bit of a conversation today about what's holding us back. So to help me with that discussion, we've got Daniel Gosselin, National Director, of Energy at BGIS, Brent Gilmore, Chief Commercial Officer at Canada Green Building Council, Elizabeth McDonald, Board Member at Sustainable Buildings, and those three are all here with me in Ottawa, and then Rob Dietrich, CFO at Armstrong Fluid Technology, and our sponsor is with us from Toronto. So as Sarah said before, I want to just emphasize that there is a Q&A button on the side there, and that we're going to want to have an interactive session with you on the Q&A, and that we'll answer whatever we can in the session, and then if we have to, we'll take questions away and answer whatever we can't do live. So with that, I'd like now to open up the discussion and start with you, Daniel. And I mean, you look at the big picture of government operations. So can you tell us what's happening now and maybe a little bit about what opportunities lie ahead?
Sure. So BGIS, we are the operators of many of the public works and some other government department buildings. Approximately 450 buildings across the country. So these contracts are known as RP1 and RP2. Many people are familiar with it, and the services include everything from cleaning the buildings to supporting the tenants to repairs in the building, as well as implementing repair projects, as well as major retrofit projects. Energy management is a big part of that service. And I have been on the contracts for about 4 years, when the Liberal government came on board, and there was a big push on carbon reduction. And what we've been able to do over the last 4 years is build up the team and also develop with the industry a roadmap for getting to carbon neutral in these buildings that we operate for the government. And up to now, what we've done is we've got 3 projects that are underway. These are major, very, very large retrofits across, well, there's 2 in Ottawa and 1 in Toronto. And we've got about another 45 studies completed, and that covers about 50% of the emissions that we're talking about from the buildings that we operate. Obviously, what we targeted is the larger buildings. And now we are ready to proceed with implementation of as many of these buildings as possible. You know, I wouldn't say shovel ready, but we're definitely ready to go right into design. We already know what the solutions are. So we're hoping to proceed in that vein in the coming years.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So now if I could turn to Brent, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about the larger picture around energy efficiency and the work that you've done for so many years in communities, and kind of what kind of detailed pathfinding you're doing.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Velma. So let me just, I think Velma set up really nicely a bit of the challenge and the opportunity that we're going to get into. So just at that high level, I think when we talk about what we're seeing in energy efficiency in the community level, but across communities, we lose a lot of energy at the energy end use perspective, right? If you think of communities, it's 60% of our energy end use. So in terms of hot water, in terms of cooling and space heating occurs in our built environment. But when I just think about where we're spending most of our time, I think when we set our context for a conversation, we're spending a lot of it indoors, right? 90% right now. And only 7% of that is outdoors. And so what we also know is that most buildings, regardless of where you are, were not optimized for people. They were built to meet a prescriptive code that was focused on safety first and foremost, and was introduced to really meet certain acceptable expectations for heating, cooling, and the domestic hot water. So with that presents us kind of an interesting opportunity, and I think this is where we'll head. What's happening now with building? It's twofold. First, we care a lot more about people's health, wellness, and happiness, as it directly is important to productivity. That's clear. We've measured that, studied that, and seen that globally. And it's conclusive. And second, and this is where I think it underscores everything that CAGBC is really focused on in the critical decade of action, buildings are essential contributor to our challenge and the solution to meeting our 2030 and 2050 objectives across Canada. And so with those two drivers together simultaneously requires a slightly different tack, especially for portfolio owners, whether you are on the private side or something similar to like the Government of Canada, who can be both a leader in the marketplace to shape direction, but also an implementer as a significant owner and operator of buildings. And I look forward to talking about some of those solutions are a little bit later.
Thanks so much, Brent. Elizabeth, I wonder if you could maybe just, as we like to say, double click on the questions around building codes and some of your very direct experience on energy efficiency nationally.
So I should be honest, I'm probably the only one that's had 2 lives. I started off in film and television and then came to energy efficiency and renewable energy. So it's been an interesting way to look at life. I was sat on the Building Code Conservation Advisory Committee, commonly known as BCAC in Ontario. And I learned, I think the very first lesson I learned, and Ontario is very aggressive in its building codes, et cetera, is that's a floor. So when I read articles and see people saying, oh, the building codes will cure all of that, they provide the floor, but to really have a high functioning building with sustainability and wellness taken in, you have to go beyond the floor. In Ontario, you already started, or you did, I'm not sure where we're going now, it was 20% above, the same in BC, but it varies across the country. So that's the first thing, that those people who go on and say the building codes will cure them all, no, it just provides you with the floor. I think the second thing is I actually spoke to some people working with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank in preparing for this. And one of their comments about procurement and how government works in the sustainable area is that they set targets, et cetera, and they do that. But they work with advisors. They have a list of recognized advisors who will not be selling the product. I mean, whether it would be HRAI for HVAC because they can't sell a particular product, but advising them on the technology, because they see one of the problems they have at the World Bank and at the Asian Development Bank is keeping up. So I think there's an opportunity. I think we have good people in Canada who will do that. And I think you'll get innovation, right sizing, which makes such a difference. And all of those things will come together. But that, from both people who are deeply involved, they both underline the importance of having access to experts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for providing that global perspective, because we are dealing with this on a global level. So now I'd like to turn to Rob and ask, I mean, you're there on the front lines, you design technology and install technology. So can you, for this sector and for addressing this challenge around greening government and getting to better environments in the MUSH sector, what advice do you have? And I know you've got a few barriers, but maybe you could just pick one or two.
Yeah,
for
I'm really going to frame it in two ways. I mean, the first, I'd like to start with the fact that the Pan-Canadian framework and then the expert panel on sustainable finance, both identified that government, the leadership of government is so important in demonstrating that buildings can be retrofitted and that we can save energy through that retrofitting. So it's very important for us to discuss, what some of the inhibitions are, what some of the barriers are for governments to actually take that lead, because policies have been developed, but implementation has not been successful, and we all know that. And I think there are a few sort of headline items that we could discuss. One is that in the federal government's case, as Dan well knows, the federal budget for 2020 hasn't been passed. And so while there may be projects that are in the pipeline, there's no money or approval to spend. This may well be the case in other jurisdictions as well. With respect to the way that buildings are managed, as Dan mentioned, in the federal government with RP1 and RP2 contracts, there are accountabilities that fall upon companies such as BGIS that can inhibit contracting of retrofits of buildings, and it's just a complication in contracting. And of course, PSPC isn't the only owner of buildings or operator of buildings in Canada. There's also Department of Defense, Crown corporations, federal agencies, and some of those are actually in third-party owned facilities. And where the governments are only tenants and not owners of those buildings. And that's an impediment for government to have its operations more energy efficient. Elizabeth quite rightly is talking about building codes. They don't serve the purpose for being energy efficient, and that's an issue. And finally, I think that there's the problem that a lot of our engineering of these solutions relies on sort of legacy solutions as opposed to innovative solutions. And I think we should talk more in this session about the application of innovative technologies and how they can advance the progress on energy efficiency in public buildings.
I think that's great, Rob. So why don't we just take that last point up and start from there, which is everyone on this panel knows that we're dealing with a lot of legacy systems. As I said, the recent weeks on long-term care facilities has sort of really exposed in a very stark way kind of some of the deficiencies in those buildings and those facilities. So how do we make a case? Because this essentially boils down to a buying decision about when is it that you're going to cross the threshold and make an investment in a new configuration of your building, whether that's a retrofit or a new building. So to each of the panelists, I'd just like to have you offer one or two ideas about how it is that we we move this forward? How do we move from legacy buildings into accelerating retrofits and new buildings? And if I can start, maybe Daniel, with you.
Well, it's a very good question. The challenge with with facilities, and this isn't just with federal government, is that I mean they're capital intensive investments, and a lot of our infrastructure in Canada, and I can speak on the federal government side, is the buildings are at the end of their life, and we're at a point now where there have been so many years of deferred maintenance, and the maintenance costs are growing, that we're at a point where it's almost a must that we need to do them. The challenge that we're seeing is where to start. How do the investments dovetail with the other programmatic priorities of the owner, of the tenants? How do you deal with the fact that many of these retrofits require significant disruption to the occupants? These are a lot of the challenges that need to be considered, and lastly, it's is deciding to invest that money, whether it's government or it's private, into the infrastructure, and convincing the people who are in charge of that money that these are the right investments to make. I think on the government side, you often see, and the reason that we've got the deference is the opinion, or the public opinion, of spending money on government properties rather than on the constituents.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And it's the understanding that the payout period, whether that's a policy payout or an efficiency payout or straight costs in terms of the overall efficiency of the buildings. Brent?
Thanks, Elma. There are, and I think people who are living this day in and day out recognize there's a number of market hurdles, no matter how we approach that, from a understanding of what is inhibiting a wider uptake of retrofits across Canada. Most of us will point very quickly and directly towards various types of financial mechanisms that might be lacking. We've seen various ways of addressing this, and through innovative programs like the Investors' Confidence Project, which has been advancing to help really bundle and provide confidence to those who are the investors who are putting money forward, or to those who are the actual client in this case, who might be the owner operator, but what they're actually receiving, to help kind of address what might be a lack of understanding of where they need to put best practice in retrofits. So I think as we start to encourage the uptake of these various mechanisms which address well-identified market barriers, or in this case, just people and their understanding of what needs to happen, and their confidence in terms of their hurdle of what they might need to achieve, which goes back to Daniel's point too, then we can start to see some traction. But my second point I want to make here, if it's just referring to the federal government itself, is stay the course on greening government. If we think about where we're at and what we're trying to accomplish with large-scale investment uptake, we've got a significant national portfolio addressing multiple different buildings. All of that require, for the most part, investment to be upgraded in some fashion. We recognize, though, that if we're going to be investing in the importance of reducing not only energy, you got to reduce our carbon impact. And equally, at the same time, you can address your health and safety in buildings. I think a great example of this, just in terms of where people can see results, you've had the National Capital Region, you've had the investment by PSPC when they moved forward, and still are, with the Smart Buildings Initiative. That's with 100 buildings across Canada that they're investing in. What's good about that, it went to something that was tangible, that people could focus on. It was recognizing that data can help ground a good decision, inform a next step. And with that, I think you actually saw two things. You saw investments going into mechanical and electrical systems to address some of the efficiencies and to actually build a base of understanding. And while you move forward on that, at the same time, it allows you to make some really critical investments that they may not have been ready to do prior to this. And that's particularly now investing in high quality air intake for a building. You might not have done that before without this information. And just as equally important is humidity. We're talking about air quality, but if we're talking about health and safety and being able to re-enter when we get back into a comfortable workspace, which is what people are after, and a safe and healthy working environment, we already know, proven, that you need higher intake of air, yeah, but just as equally, you need to have the right humidity. And that's where you reduce your transmissions of various forms like influenza and viruses. Those are very important things. But it started, if you were going to see investments there, with understanding where to invest and how to invest. And it started with good data collection.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brent. Rob, I'm going to turn to you. And the other thing I'll ask you is if like Brent, you could point to a couple of projects or examples of things that are working, please.
Well, things that are working that we've seen, one is that while there are large projects, and I understand some of the large government projects are deep retrofits because of the age of the building, there's ample opportunity in the portfolios of buildings to do what might be, if you want to call it a deep retrofit, than a shallow retrofit, but in what we call an energy upgrade. And what we're finding is that you can take a step-by-step approach and to upgrading the mechanical plant in a building and achieve significant energy savings, and that those energy savings actually pay for successive steps in the overall project. And so you can start small and end up with a very good outcome, all paid, really pay-as-you-go methodology.
Because it
The
pays
second thing I'd suggest is that, you know, in that expert panel on sustainable finance, there are a few ideas of how projects could be financed using the green bank or the infrastructure bank as a pool of capital. And perhaps in government buildings, we need to take a look at this issue of retrofitting of buildings and somehow carve out the financing and use a mechanism such as the infrastructure bank and have contractors use those funds to complete the work, financed through a mechanism such as that, or the infrastructure bank guaranteeing bank loans from the private sector to provide the funding, and the savings in turn will repay the loans. And I think the previous panel also discussed this as a funding mechanism for these kinds of projects.
That's great, thanks. I'm going to switch, Elizabeth, because we've got a question here about the greening of government footprints, and I know that you know a little bit about this, so I'm going to direct this next question to you to start. But, you know, there's an open question about our governments doing, what are they doing? And maybe you could talk to some of what you know about what's happening across Canada in terms of greening government operations.
Well, I think it varies across the country, and part of the unfortunate reason is when you talk about government, then you get tied to elections, so it depends on who's in power at the time, and that is one of the challenges of being in this, where in this area where you have, it's high tide and low tide, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. I think the federal government is going in the right direction. I think they've got a lot of demands on them. I would say that overall, though, one of the challenges is that the constituents, the Canadians, don't understand. We haven't found a way that will make politicians comfortable to talk about the value for those dollars, the jobs that are being created across the country, because almost all of these projects will take in local contractors who are trained here, who pay taxes here, etc. And I think we have to help government more when we talk about those projects. I think we have an opportunity right now. First of all, everything stops, so people are thinking. But I think the other part of it, the opportunity is that people are very concerned about their health. And so I think sometimes when we talk about sustainability, people say they believe in it. They just don't know why it's so expensive, et cetera. But now you have an opportunity to prove that value for dollar and at the same time provide a healthy environment. And so I think that this will be helpful to government. I know, for example, the Ontario government is very concerned about how they're going to proceed on long-term care homes, which will be particularly in the public domain. And I think it's the first time they've ever talked to people in the building sector and say, what does this mean? Because it's sort of like great if you do it with the staffing, but if you still have 4 people in a room and sharing one bathroom, it's not going to get better. So I think it's talking about the value for money, and that's where those projects come from. I think it's taking advantage of the opportunity now. And I think perhaps promoting more the innovation. There's a lot of innovation in this country when the opportunity is there. And there's a lot we can be proud of because we have a difficult client. So that's how I look at it.
Wonderful. Daniel, would you like to weigh in on this question about how the government's doing on greening the footprint? And you're muted.
Of course, we've been talking about mute all this time, and I still forget. I think the will is there. The decisions are made that as retrofits are done or any project is done, it is with the intention of taking a step forward in reducing carbon emissions. That commitment is made, and I believe that that isn't going to change. And what I'm hoping is that by doing these projects and showing that not only they're carbon neutral, but they're also cost neutral, that they are good investments. We're not saying we're going to spend money on things that won't ever provide a return to future generations financially. We're proposing very fiscally responsible retrofits. I think we're going to be able to demonstrate to the rest of the built environment that this is doable. And yes, there's new technology that's going to be implemented, but a lot of it is things that our people can do, our contractors can do. We have the equipment, we have the technologies. We're going to be adding on, obviously, the smarts to it to that we can do more data collection. But we're really on the right track, and I'm encouraged to be able to demonstrate to the rest of the industry that this is doable, and it doesn't cost that much more, and it does return on itself. And there was a lost thought, and I've lost it. I'll come back to it later. Thank you.
Well, but I think you've said some important things, and things that will certainly resonate with every level of government, including municipal governments, which is that it can be fiscally responsible. It can be both carbon and cost neutral. And the other thing I think that is often misunderstood about the building sector is that the payout period is actually much shorter with these new technologies, and the add-on benefits are significant for other kinds of things. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and address one of the other questions that's here. And I'm really going to address this to Brent and Rob, and we're going to talk about the difference between shallow retrofits and deep retrofits, because the question is, I think, a smart one, and I think it's one that everybody who's managing a building, whether it's a home or a commercial or industrial building, tries to reckon with, and you've both touched on it, which is what's a bite-sized piece. So the question is, now that companies have less cash flow and are cutting down spending, how should we proceed with ensuring that there is still money for retrofits? How do we have ideas? And Rob, I'm going to start with you, because I think you said on the shallow retrofit side that you could make these things kind of modular and doable. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Certainly, and when you and as I mentioned, the previous panel had quite a vigorous discussion. I think everybody contributed to the discussion about the economics of retrofits, and but there are many situations that we see on a daily basis where a very modest investment could be made to have a significant impact in the amount of energy and therefore greenhouse gas emission reduction of that building. And there are also financing mechanisms available that could turn those kinds of projects into what we would say is pay-as-you-go projects, so that us or financing partners, there's lots of people in the private sector that would finance these kinds of jobs. And quite literally, the savings in electricity bills would pay for the first phase of these projects. And then once you do the first phase, you get more information about how your building's operating, and that helps to inform you as to what the next steps in the process would be.
Thank you.
So it becomes a self-financing project.
Yes, super. Thank you for that explanation. Brent?
Thanks, Velma. Well, as Robert mentioned, there's a range of responses one can take to addressing, as you say, shallow versus deep. And the big difference is when you go deep, you're really starting to address everything from your envelope improvements, from windows, all the way down to your mechanical systems and how you can optimize the volume and flow of whether it's water to anything you're pumping. And it's quite intensive versus a modular staged approach, as Robert was articulating, which can make a lot of sense as you start to get a plan. But that's something we had articulated. When you are in a situation where people are limited in the ability to access cash, how do you respond to encouraging retrofits in a timely manner, which give you a payback over a period of time? So there's three things that I think we've been encouraging more in terms of thought and investment direction. One that the Government of Canada can give more thought to is to help support the stimulation of those shovel-worthy projects through 0% financing of energy audits. I think that's something that we're seeing. It would pretty much directly address this issue of cash, but also give people a little bit more access to available financing. Two, one of the things that we're seeing, and I think we've heard it from several actually, was how to effectively use the support of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. I think this is something where we could look at a first loss loan reserve. Has been a really interesting area of focus and conversation, allowing qualified lenders to recover about 80% of their principal around accrued interest on loans, which really support deep retrofit projects in the event of default. So basically what we're doing and encouraging is removing that issue of confidence and that likelihood of project viability. And I think that again gives people a willingness to want to invest limited dollars in cash that they have available right now. That's a more comprehensive approach versus what I think Robert was really getting at, which again makes a lot of sense. You may not be able to go all the way, so start smaller and pay back with incremental activities that make a lot of sense.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to give you all a few minutes at the end to kind of make some final comments, particularly around barriers or policy ideas that we could use to accelerate uptake of these technologies. Because there is a question about why the public sector, which has the additional policy motivation, the alignment with greenhouse gas emissions reductions, national, international policies, et cetera, why they tend to lag on the uptake side with the private sector. So we'll come back to that. But so there's a question about the speed of procurement processes and the amount of time that it takes to get, and you're all smiling. I can see you all smiling here. So maybe we could just spend a couple minutes talking about why the speed of procurement processes might be contributing to that one factor I just identified. Elizabeth, would you like to go first on this one?
Yes, well, I think part of it is that we're doing more value for money procurement than we did before. It's not just, as my former partner, I worked at KPMG, and they used to say, when it was just price, they used to say that the people we were dealing with, just that's all they cared about. It didn't matter what we said in it. Now I think there is some value to that, but I think it's a very difficult. I talked to several contractors here and in other places where they thought trying to put your qualifications and meet all of that, it's endless. So I know the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank do a lot of pre-qualification, at least lower the size of the pot of people so that they can proceed. In some cases, what they do then is they bring them into a sort of bidders information situation where they will have industry experts and sort of toss around ideas with no absolute guarantee that you'll know that one of the companies will win. But what it does do is it makes it more interactive, which I think works better for the people who are deciding. And these are obviously multi-billion-dollar projects, so I guess a conversation is warranted. But I think there is a frustration level at that. I don't know how you can do it. I mean, in the end, I think the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank are doing it in a good way. I think those conversations with recognized experts that don't have an economic interest and even bringing the contractors together is a great idea. I just think one of the challenges is when you do that, I think what happens for the people who are working in a department that's responsible anywhere in the world have to be sure, are always wanting to make sure that they are being transparent.
Fair enough. That's
one of the things I will say though about Canada, and both the two consultants I talked to from the international organizations both said that Canada is very good about transparency of its documentation and information, probably one of the best. So, you know, we are better than we think, but I do also know that for many consulting firms, the cost of responding to an RFP has to be taken into consideration.
Okay, that's fair. That's a great thing to note. Who wants to go next? I think maybe Daniel. How about you?
So as a pure procurer of work on behalf of the federal government, I can say that yes, it's keeping it open, fair, and transparent is the #1 priority. The downside of that is it takes longer and it costs more. There are additional costs. And then when you're doing your procurement at every level, whether it's consultants or contractors, it simply is very difficult to maintain the open, transparent, and fair, and really get the best outcome because there's no real easy way to be able to judge beyond a proposal response the quality of the work. We are constantly trying to improve that, and we are moving very much towards value for money and not just low price. It's a priority of ours so that we get good outcomes, but it's a challenge.
Thanks. Rob, how about you?
Yeah, one thought, and when in these large projects that Daniel's dealing with, I mean, there is an obligation to be thorough and transparent, etc. But when we're talking about some of the smaller projects, one provincial jurisdiction I'm aware of, has actually done the work to set a specification specifically for energy retrofits. And so, it does include what I would call aspirational building code standards. And so they've done the work already in advance to document what technologies and what outcomes they want from these projects, so that when they identify a building to be upgraded, all that work has been done and the industry is well aware of what that specification is. So that's one idea that could work to get the pipeline of smaller projects moving, to not have to re-specify each job.
Perfect. Brent, do you want to weigh in on this? And sure. Just a note to our audience, thanks for hanging in with us. We're going to finish at 3:15 promptly as advertised. So thank you for being there, and we'll be doing our last round in just a couple minutes. Brent.
Sure. And the theme that you hear, I think, consistently from people is predictability and confidence of what we're trying to get at. And that is an underlying aspect of any form of investor's confidence, whether you're a government or whether you're the procurement agent. And we have done everything possible to disrupt that at different times. So there's two things I'd like to suggest. One, we assume that those who are doing the procurement and those who are informing the policy understand what we're talking about. And in all fairness, we have moved at a lightning speed to introduce many aspects around zero carbon energy efficiency. And so I would stress that our federal government, public civil servants are on the front line. They need a bit of chance to have a chance to upskill and upgrade themselves about what is going on in the marketplace and what do they need to know. And so ensuring that they are equipped with a common understanding of the importance, particularly of embodied and operational carbon to the construction and operation of buildings, goes a long way with them asking, why is that important and how do I encourage that? But most of us in that space don't have that understanding, and we have to try and gather it quickly. So that's one suggestion we have, is just helping to invest in our own public sector workforce knowledge understanding, and particularly the identified and recognized gap that they're all very much willing to state they don't always know. And so two, the second point I think I'd like to just kind of encourage goes to this aspect. It was a question also about the US Department of Defense being so much more advanced in the uptake of various technologies and what's going on. They have made the front and center the priority of reducing emissions from a performance standpoint outright. And everything beyond that is driven by that. And I think that is an incredibly important principled perspective. It's principled, as in this is primary, make that happen. And people respond to that in terms of how they go about encouraging response in the marketplace, which is fundamental. And Robert talked about the aggregation and making it simple. And this is my last point. All of this at some point has to go back to Treasury Board. For those of in the federal government, we understand the decision-making processes. They need confidence that what you are going to invest in and see as the outcome actually was achieved. And Robert talked about predictability. That's the idea of the Investors' Confidence Project. It's standardized best practices, known for what you should be achieving in a retrofit, so that when you go to procure it and you go to encourage it, it's basically ticking boxes, and that when you go to report on it, you have a good idea of what you should be seeing. So I think these are some of these basic concepts that we want to make sure are instilled within our activities, whether in procurement on the federal or private sector side, will get us a long way in the next 10 years.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for such an interesting conversation. I think the two panels built on each other, and we're coming at it from slightly different angles, but I hope everyone's taking away what kind of innovation and advances there are in the building technology sector and what's available to us to solve many problems at the same time. So with that, I'd like to do what I would call a rapid fire round and give each of you just 1 minute to make a final comment as we close out the session. Rob, maybe I could ask you to go first, please.
I'd love to. Thanks, Velma. The one area that we haven't touched on, but I'm going to finish with it, is that there are many innovative Canadian companies in the clean tech sector who have solutions to offer all building owners in the country to reduce carbon emissions and make their systems more effective. Government should embrace this innovation and should adopt aspirational targets for energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, and not rely on an outdated US-led building code.
Thank you very much. That's very pointed. Elizabeth, how about if you go next with that comment on building codes?
Yes, well, just never forget they're a floor, not the ceiling. I think the other thing we have to recognize is these undertakings create jobs, and they are local jobs, and we often miss that. This will get people working in innovative ways, in doing the right things, etc., but they will create jobs. And right now, with so many people not working, that has to be something we have to remind people about. And I think finally, I have to agree with Brent in a very important way. We have to help our public servants. I think it's really tough for them. We sit down and say, you should do all this, but you can't travel, you can't do this, you can't do that. And most employers invest in their employees, and we have great public servants in this country, but they should be able to go out, experience, know what the technologies are, have contacts themselves. And I think we really have to invest in public servants as well.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Daniel.
So just quickly, I'm going to take more of an approach about what we've learned through the federal government and the direction we're going. First of all, is don't lock into any retrofit upgrades that are going to lock you into carbon emissions for a long time. The best example is don't just replace the boiler with a more efficient boiler. Look at replacing the heating system with a low carbon option. Do try to bundle options together in order to get the best return on investment. But also, as Robert was mentioning, is create a plan that's long-term, and as things get to the end of their life, improve them so that you're constantly reducing your carbon. You have a target to reduce and eliminate all your carbon at the end. We're also looking much more at carbon budgets rather than just having an end date for having no carbon emissions. That means looking at the cumulative carbon emissions. So that's a new way of looking at things. And finally, just in terms of the Internet of Things, data collection, that is sort of the new frontier, and we are going to be moving in that direction quite a bit.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. Brent, super short to bring us home.
Federal government's doing an immense amount of investment in helping to demystify what are the right products to be using and drawing on for them to actually get to their carbon reduction emissions. Couldn't stress enough about us getting familiar with what that actually means. So 3 words, if everyone walks away and looks them up at the end of the day: environmental product declaration. In doing so, you know what you're getting from it, what's it going to do in terms of a zero carbon reduction potential, and with that you can guide some of your decision making and clarity, not only for manufacturers who are investing heavily in this to make it easier for us who do procurement, but also for those who have to actually measure success at the end of the day and report out on it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I noted those 3 words, noted. And I would like to thank everyone who's joined us today for your time and your attention. We've answered most of the questions. As Sarah said, we will be sending a note to all of you, and we will be doing a summary, a write-up and a summary, so that all of you can join us in trying to advance this conversation and see if we can accelerate the adoption of more efficient buildings. So thank you very much.